why don't I go ahead and introduce Jessica tonight? Of course, for a lot of you, she doesn't need much of an introduction. A very familiar face around these parts. But Jessica is the author of Exploring Women's Suffrage Through 50 Historic Treasures. And that's actually what the theme of tonight's lecture is going to be about. Jessica is currently the VP of Collections and Storytelling at Minnetrista. Did I pronounce it right? Awesome. That's a tricky one. But before she was there, she was actually the curator here at the Litchfield Historical Society. And she was on our staff from 2009 through 2015. And in 2015, she was the curator of the exhibit on women's suffrage, which was called Ballots for Both, the Fight for Equal Voting Rights. We actually have an abridged version of that exhibit on display right now down in the Tapping Reef Meadow. So after this lecture, if you feel like you need just more celebration of women's suffrage, you can check out that exhibit. It's open daily, dawn to dusk. And yeah, so I think without further ado, Jessica, welcome. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the show over to you.
Sounds good. All right, let me see if I can get my screen share going here. All right. Okay, so hopefully this works out, and fair warning, I did tell Kate before we got going that sometimes my webcam and mic have a little bit of a problem. So if I get a little Mr. Roboto on you, she's gonna let me know and we're gonna fix that. But you know, hi to everyone. My name is Jessica, like Kate said, and I'm really glad to be joining all of you this evening. And I'd first like to start out really by thanking the Historical Society for inviting me to speak with you tonight. While yes, I am a former staff member, the Litchfield Historical Society, which does make this evening a little bit like coming home for me. I'm really, more importantly, just a really huge fan of the museum and the programs, the exhibitions, and the community engagement that the institution offers. And I'm really honored to play even just, a very small part of that here tonight. So as Kate said, I am the Vice President of Collections and Storytelling at Minnetrista, a museum and gardens in East Central Indiana. But in addition to my role overseeing the management of Minnetrista's museum collection and exhibition program, I'm also an independent historian of women's suffrage. And suffrage is really a topic that I find to be fascinating, heartbreaking, and really exhilarating all at the same time. So today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my new book, Exploring Women's Suffrage Through 50 Historic Treasures. So to start out, I want to give you some context for the book and provide a little bit of insight into the process behind writing it. And then what I'd like to do with the rest of the time is just share with you a few of the stories that you'll find within those pages of the book. So while 2020 has certainly been a bit of a unique year so far, we're here today because this year marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And that groundbreaking legislation provided countless women with the opportunity to vote. That was really a citizenship right that they had formerly been fighting for over 70 years. So while an organized push for women's voting rights had existed nationwide for over 7 decades at the time of the amendment's passage, the roots of the struggle extend much, much earlier. And here in the United States, the story begins as early as the 18th century, and the legacy of suffrage really can still be felt in society today. So for me, one of the most compelling things about the history of suffrage is that it really is a story of all people, not just women, but also men. It's a history that really encompasses all social classes. It's a story of immigrants. It's a story of families with really deep American roots, both Black and white. And it's also a really complex history in that while the 19th Amendment provided many women with the right to vote after its passage, many immigrants, women of color, and women of low economic status really continued to find themselves barred from the polls through a variety of local laws and restrictive voting taxes and requirements. So With such a really complex and far-reaching history, where does one start when pulling together a book on a topic as large as women's voting rights? Now, for me, the idea for this book really formed over time and over a handful of years. So for many years, I kind of spent time finding time to squirrel away, researching state and local suffrage histories. And as I did that, I really began wondering what part I could play in commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And to be honest, that was a question that I had really had churning in the back of my mind for many, many years. And to kind of bring in the local connection for you guys, it was probably around 2013 or 2014. I had given an afternoon talk at the Historical Society in Litchfield about the Connecticut suffrage movement. And after I finished my talk that day, I actually ended up in a very lengthy and animated conversation with Dr. Lynn Brickley, a longtime trustee and supporter of the museum. And as Lynn and I stood and talked about the many aspects of the suffrage movement and the history of women's rights, she really urged me, both as a woman and a supporter of women's history, to find a way to play a part in commemorating the 19th Amendment when this anniversary year rolled around. So I'd had that in the back of my head for a while, Lynn's voice kind of chipping away at my brain of, what are you going to do, Jessica? What are you going to do? So ultimately, after bouncing around a few different ideas, I landed on one in particular, a book that would show off the many really fantastic artifacts, archives, historic structures, and pieces of public art that the suffrage movement left around our nation. And having focused my career on working with museum collections, I knew that these unique artifacts could really be entry points for telling many stories connected to the larger suffrage narrative. And as a suffrage researcher, I had been, had a pretty good working knowledge of the many really interesting suffrage materials that are kind of scattered around the country in various repositories. So with that in mind, I set out to produce a book that would give the reader really a broad overview of the national movement while highlighting representative state and local stories from around the country. And now I will say, in my wild enthusiasm at first, that seemed really straightforward to me. And then, of course, reality really began to sink in, like it always does, because suffrage is a huge topic. And it has many subtopics and stories and nooks and crannies to really explore, and to cover everything in one book really is impossible. So to corral my ideas, I really created a framework to work inside of as I developed the outline of the volume. And ultimately, I set out 9 broad themes that I used to organize the book, the stories and the objects presented, and really to tell the suffrage narrative. And one of the questions I often get is, okay, but why 50 suffrage treasures? Why not 100? Maybe why not as few as 25? And to be honest, 25 just didn't seem like enough to me to present a very fleshed out picture of the suffrage movement, and 100 seemed like too many. I wanted to be able to provide a short story for each object that would appear within each thematic section, but I also wanted to keep the length of the book manageable for the average reader. So after a lot of discussion with my editors, 50 kind of became that target number. And as you can imagine, I started out with a much, much, much larger list of potential treasures than 50. In fact, I had a really big spreadsheet, which you can get a glimpse of here, that I had multiple tabs and columns and sheets and pages, and I was tracking the many notes that I was continually making about so many of those artifacts that are in various museums, libraries, and historic sites around the country. Now, luckily, because I'd been researching the topic of suffrage for so long, I already had a pretty long list of collections with interesting items, or ones that I knew I should probably check into or go to and see what I could find a little bit more about. So the process of identifying those potential treasures really in many ways led me back to objects that I really consider to be old friends of mine. And at the same time, I've learned of a lot of other historic objects that I hadn't yet seen or heard of, which was really exciting. So all in all, the process was just really fun for me. And it involved speaking with many curators and archivists and the other caretakers of these objects to find out more about the histories of each item and how they made it into the collection of each museum, library, or organization. And after gathering what information I could from the owner of each potential artifact, I then undertook deeper research into each item and really began to flesh out its story and the larger historical context around each of those. Now, I will say, as someone who really loves to dig into the historic record, I was pretty much in heaven searching for information in newspapers and archival collections and the wealth of histories that are already written by so many wonderful suffrage historians. But as the saying goes, all fun must come to an end, and I did eventually have to make my final selections. So to do so, I really weighed a lot of factors. I thought about where the item was geographically located. I really wanted to be sure to have representative items from every region of the country. I also asked what kind of treasure it was. Was it a piece of artwork, maybe a historic building, a photograph, or a letter? Again, I wanted to be sure to have a wide variety in the pages of the book. And I also looked at the stories that each item told and really assessed how they fit together to really complement one another in telling that larger narrative. And I also kept an eye towards who was represented in each treasure's story. In putting this book together, I wanted to make sure that the many voices involved and impacted by the suffrage movement really could be heard. And a full view of the nation's suffrage narrative is a story of women and men, pro-suffragists and anti-suffragists, women of color, immigrants, and native-born Americans. And another important thing that I took into consideration was the size of the organization that owns each item. Just like every other area of the book, I really wanted to make sure that the treasures highlighted represented a variety of institutions. Because the truth is that historic treasures are cared for by all sizes of museums, from the very small local museum in Columbia City, Indiana, to national icons like the Smithsonian. Each and every repository houses items that really should be treasured. So I wanted that to come through in the book as well. So with my final 50 selections made, it was really time to pull it all together. And what you see today in print is where I landed. But in reality, this book really could have easily been comprised of 5 times as many artifacts or in many different orders than what they landed on. Nonetheless, when the reader flips through the pages, they're going to find a full page color image of each of those 50 treasures. And with each of those objects really opening the door, what follows is a short story of each of those highlighted objects. And when taken together as a whole, these pieces of national, state, and local history give the reader a sense of how the suffrage movement played out around the nation. So that's a little bit of, the background and the context. So with the remainder of our time, I'd like to share with you, if you don't mind, a few of those stories that appear in the book. And of course, there's no way to share all of them with you. There are 50 of them. So I've pulled out a small handful for us tonight, and I hope you're going to find them interesting and that it'll kind of give you a taste of what the book is really all about. So as I mentioned previously, I've organized the book into 9 thematic sections, and those are early years, organizations, symbols, consumer culture and publicity, allies, roadblocks and setbacks, tactics and public demonstrations, milestones, and legacy. And each of those thematic sections has between about 5 and 8 short chapters, each one highlighting a single object. So deciding which objects from the book to highlight for you tonight was a bit of a challenge because let's face it, I think that all of the artifacts in the book are great. But to get us going, I thought I'd start in the very beginning and tell you a bit about one of the objects that appears in the early years portion of my book and is also connected directly to Litchfield and the Litchfield Historical Society. So often when we talk about the suffrage movement, historians and the public have a tendency to quickly say, well, the suffrage movement started in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention when Elizabeth Cady Stanton advocated for women's right to vote. And while, of course, the Seneca Falls Convention is wildly important to the history of suffrage, the roots of the American movement really extend much further back. And long before 1848, women were really thinking about how to improve their lives. So in thinking about how women could really improve and expand their roles in society, women's education became an early focus of female reformers in the United States. And after the close of the American Revolution, a new concept gained popularity here in our country, particularly among white women of means. So known as Republican motherhood, this idea stressed that the responsibility of women to provide the early educational and moral training of their children was really on their shoulders. And according to the theory, because young boys would grow into the leaders of the nation, their early education was crucial for the survival of the young country. Now, for the concept to work, mothers would need to have a top-notch education themselves. It couldn't just be their sons. And while this idea in many circles placed women as the intellectual equal of men at the time, no one really saw it as too much of a threat as long as women remained happy to limit the use of their new knowledge to the private sphere. So the late 18th century globe, seen here, is part of the collection at the Litchfield Historical Society, and it was used by students of Sarah Pierce, a pioneering educator that you all know so well, who opened one of our nation's early female academies for girls and boys. Don't worry, Kathy, I don't forget. They're in Litchfield. And during the 30 years after its opening, Pierce's Academy enrolled more than 2,000 students from, I think, 17 states and territories, as well as pupils from Canada and the West Indies. You know, actually, I'm going to go back for a second. And through reputation and increasing enrollment, Pierce's Academy really thrived in the early 19th century. And not only did the school enable Pierce to support herself and her family, but it also established a model of education that valued the abilities of women and did not assume that their sex limited their potential for learning. So while Pierce's students undertook a variety of ornamental subjects such as painting, needlework, music that were really popular at the time, what really set Pierce's school apart was her focus on the academic subjects. Subjects like English, ancient and European history, geography, arithmetic, philosophy, and rhetoric. So innovating even further, Pierce tied the ornamental subjects to the academic ones, and that was pretty unique. So for instance, rather than simply have students paint watercolor after watercolor just for art's sake, Pierce's students depicted scenes from literature, or they hand-painted beautiful maps that were informed by the careful study of globes like the one seen here and the work of well-known cartographers. And in doing so, what happened is that artwork really enforced their studies of geography. So ultimately, Pierce played a really crucial role in setting up a very strong network of female education in the United States. And as her students opened schools of their own, a domino effect really began to happen throughout the 19th century, and more women found opportunities for well-rounded education. Now, something to note is that while Pierce and many of her fellow early female educators did not believe that women had a place in politics, ironically, their schools produced prominent female reformers, including abolitionists and women's rights advocates who would absolutely go on, and there's a direct chain link of those women to the suffrage movement. And with their strong oratory and analytical thinking skills that they honed while attending schools such as Pierce's, these women were really poised to think beyond education. And with time, they put their minds to work, using their intellect to campaign for the right to vote. And that was really a necessity for them if they wanted their voices heard and their education really used to its fullest potential. So absolutely, you heard it here, without a doubt, the role that Sarah Pierce played in helping to establish a culture of female education was absolutely vital to laying the groundwork for the organized suffrage movement that came just a few decades later. So in addition to exploring the roots of America's organized suffrage movement, I've also included in my book a section about how women organized themselves once a really formal push for women's suffrage began in the United States. And in addition to national and state organizations, there were also countless scads, if you will, local suffrage groups that popped up around the nation. And as I stated earlier, the suffrage movement, despite what's often been depicted in popular culture and in some historic research, it was really a very diverse movement. And knowing that, I really wanted to incorporate objects that led to many kinds of stories in this book. And to be honest, I was really torn between two objects from my organization section to share with you tonight, but I did have to make a decision. And right here, this is it. This church pew dating to 1891 is part of the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And shortly after its production, it was moved into Quinn Chapel, the home of the oldest Black congregation in the city of Chicago. So from pews like this one at Quinn Chapel, the congregation there heard speeches from notable activists such as Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. many, many decades later. And in addition to attracting major activists, the church really also served as a place for the local community to promote social change. And the topic of women's suffrage had been promoted at Quinn Chapel as early as the 1860s. And in a 1913 meeting that occurred at Quinn Chapel, what really happened is Chicago's Black suffragists kind of really popped up on the map and started down a path to success. So on January 5th, 1913, Belle Squire, who was one of Chicago's most prominent white suffragists, she joined Black Chicago activist Ida Wells Barnett at Quinn Chapel to encourage Chicago's women of color to form an organization to help fight for women's voting rights. So speaking to the crowd, this is what Squire said. She said, "The time has come when we suffragists must broaden our views and enlist all women to our cause, regardless of race or color, if we are to be successful." So while Squire may have issued this call to action from one of those pews at the church, it was really Ida Wells Barnett who took the reins. And what she did is she established the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first Black suffrage organization in the state of Illinois and the only one of its kind in Chicago, which is quite remarkable considering the large population of people of color that existed in Chicago at that time. But in addition to focusing on securing voting rights for women, the Alpha Suffrage Club also remained highly focused on advancing Chicago's Black community. And a little bit like Providence, in fact, within 5 months of the Alpha Suffrage Club forming, the state of Illinois granted women the right to vote in presidential and municipal elections. And this not only made Illinois the first state east of the Mississippi River to do so, but it also marked a really huge milestone for Black women. Not allowing this achievement to slow their work, however, the women of the Alpha Suffrage Club turned their focus really quickly to educating newly enfranchised Black female voters, as well as female prisoners at the Bridewell Penitentiary. So they felt really strongly about this. Rather than leave imprisoned women stigmatized and ignored at the penitentiary, club members really took the opportunity to help educate those women at Bridewell about their new voting rights in an attempt to really make sure that all women were aware of their rights and responsibilities. And through the work of the Alpha Suffrage Club, the number of Black women and men registered to vote in Chicago really began to blossom and grow and in many ways explode. And as that number continued to expand, the club encouraged Black men to run for office. And in 1915, the group played a major role in electing Oscar DePriest as the first Black alderman in Chicago's history. And DePriest would later make history again when he was elected the first Northern Black representative to the United States Congress in 1928. So really by focusing their efforts on first advocating for women's voting rights and then pivoting and working to educate and uplift the Black community, the women of Quinn Chapel and the Alpha Suffrage Club really proved that they were a major force in Chicago. And around the nation, other Black women facing growing inequality and racism really took interest in the suffrage cause and looking at the Alpha Suffrage Club as a model for themselves. And really, rather than be held back by these forces of inequality, Black suffragists kind of just took that and they worked even harder to gain their voting rights. And very wisely, they knew that the vote was just very, very crucial, and it was going to be that crucial tool needed to protect Black communities from violence and injustice and to work towards greater racial reform in the nation. So when pulling my book together, I also knew right away that I wanted to include a section on consumer culture and publicity. And one of the things that I hope that readers will take away from the book is that from photographs that maybe document marches to quilts that are pieced together from campaign ribbons, the suffrage movement left behind a very rich physical record of its story. And while some of the items, such as letters, were private, other objects had always been intended by suffragists themselves for public consumption and to publicize the suffrage cause. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we were really in a time in our country where there was a massive shift happening in consumer culture. And as the nation was modernizing, industrialization and technology really began to boom. And this led to more and more mass-produced items on store shelves. And as suffragists saw this happening, they picked up on an opportunity. And they began producing a really huge array of goods, ranging from votes for women buttons and pennants to posters to cookbooks and almost any other item. And they were really quite savvy and realized very quickly that by pushing their message into consumer culture, they could really shift the suffrage message into mainstream America. So they really grabbed that bull by the horns and just went after it. So with these countless manufactories popping up around the nation, getting Votes for Women merchandise produced really wasn't a difficult task at all. It was pretty darn easy. But once suffragists had the items on hand, how they would get them from their hands out into the hands of the public was a completely different question. Getting it made was one thing, getting it out into people's homes was another. And for some suffrage groups, the answer of how to do that really rests in a new kind of shopping, the department store. So in the early 20th century, the department store was not only convenient and a one-stop shop location, but it was really the preferred way that Americans shopped at that time. And in New York City, Macys Herald Square proved a very, very fruitful partner for New York suffragists. So most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the site of Macys Herald Square. The annual Thanksgiving Day parade has brought decades of attention to the storefront, and well, maybe not so much right now. Typically, the store draws in countless shoppers and tourists who are eager to pick up maybe a piece of clothing or see the beautiful floral displays that happen during the annual flower show that takes place in the store. But what shoppers don't often realize is that Macys Herald Square is a National Historic Landmark. And on top of that, it also has a very strong connection to New York's suffrage movement. So in 1912, Macys may not have been a draw because of its historic charm, but it certainly was a huge draw of shoppers, and particularly shoppers eager to come by the store and see the elaborate window displays that the company produced. And it was those window displays specifically that suffragists wanted to utilize to communicate to mass crowds. So with a heavily advertised nighttime suffrage parade approaching, suffragists and Macys really teamed up. And with a little bit of effort, suffragists hoped to grab the attention of tried and true Macys shoppers And Macys hoped that the suffrage parade might drive a little bit of extra business their way. So leading up to the evening of the parade, New York suffragists ran many newspaper articles promoting the event. And in those press pieces, they specifically named Macys the headquarters for suffrage supplies, and they encouraged supporters to head to the store at Herald Square to stock up on the proper regalia for the event. So at Macys, staff created a very elaborate window display to herald the upcoming march. So it was decorated in shades of yellow, which was a traditional suffrage color, and the display included a very prominently displayed American flag and a very large portrait of Julia Ward Howe, an early suffrage advocate who was well known in New York. Also on view in the window were official suffrage hats, pennants, buttons, and other items that women and activists could purchase inside the store. So once heading through the doors and inside, shoppers were directed to a special suffrage section of Macys that had been set up specifically for the week of the parade. And for only $1.69, a bargain price, you could purchase a complete marching outfit. And that included a war bonnet, hat pins, lanterns, a suffrage sash, a chrysanthemum, stole, 2 buttons, and a pennant. So you were set to go, your whole body, and something to wave in your hand would be ready to state that you were pro-women's voting rights. So once you had all of those items, you really were set to join the parade as a marcher and to really align yourself visually with like-minded women. So what the final sales total was is a little bit hard to say, but newspaper accounts reported thousands of participants at the parade carrying lanterns and torches and wearing official hats and regalia as they advocated for women's voting rights. So really, no matter how much money people spent, Macys and local suffragists both seemed pretty pleased with the outcome. And across the nation, similar partnerships could be seen between local suffrage groups and department stores of all sizes in states like California, Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. You kind of went from coast to coast on that. And for modern suffragists, this mingling of commercial and political space was really celebrated and encouraged. Not only did it bring their movement into the daily lives of countless shoppers, but it also aligned commercial and political desires. And if women held the crucial role of household shopper and caretaker, they also kind of wondered, well, then why not hold the responsibility of voter as well? And that's what they went after. So much along the same lines as the consumer culture and publicity section, I knew almost right away when starting to work on this book that I wanted to develop a tactics and public demonstrations portion. From its earliest years, participants in the women's suffrage movement really knew their end goal. And that goal was to secure the vote for women across the United States. But to make that dream a reality, however, suffragists knew that they really needed to create, I'm going to call it a menu of tactics from which to draw on to gain support and make their voices heard. And really those tactics evolved over time, and in many instances were pretty particular to the kind of suffrage organization who was implementing them. So while some suffragists were more militant in their actions, many others were quite conservative. So as you can imagine, that means that a really wide variety of tactics emerged over time here in the United States. And on one end of the spectrum, you would have tactics such as leafleting that was very subtle in tone. And then at other times, on the other end, you would have groups who were organizing large conventions, and they lobbied lawmakers individually or in groups, and they mounted large parades. So taking these tactics to the extreme in the United States was the National Woman's Party, a more militant organization led by firebrand Alice Paul. And not one to sit quietly on the sidelines, Paul led her organization in mounting very public and very visible demonstrations. And that was very intentional on her part. And by 1917, Paul had really become very frustrated with President Woodrow Wilson's continued refusal to support a national women's suffrage amendment. So she got to work, and she had her followers get to work. And on January 10th, 1917, as World War I was raging over in Europe, a group of National Women's Party picketers arrived on the sidewalk outside of the White House, and they were the first picketers ever to demonstrate in front of the presidential home. And they carried flags with messages that read, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" As well as more conventional ones, and also some more controversial ones that compared President Wilson to the German Kaiser, boldly stating things like democracy should begin at home. They very much criticized Wilson that while our nation was working on a national stage to, help save democracy for the nation, they took it very personally that they didn't see that that was happening here at home if Wilson was unwilling to give women the right to vote. So as women continued their silent and peaceful picket, and that's important to know, it was peaceful and it was silent. They literally said nothing. Activists showed up every day for months on end, and that was despite rain and snow. That was despite heckling from onlookers, including servicemen in uniform, who were really starting to grow pretty agitated by the day about this. And by June, the president's patience had really worn pretty thin with the picketers outside the White House. He did not think it looked very good. And what happened is violent mobs broke out. So crowds, people who were not in support of women's voting rights or thought that they were being disrespectful to the president and to the nation, they began attacking the suffragists. They were destroying signs, they were assaulting the women, and police began making arrests. But not a single member of the mob was who was arrested. Rather, the police were targeting the suffragists and the pro-women's voting rights activists that were out on the sidewalks, and they were public sidewalks. And those arrests continued in the following months. And in time, authorities began jailing suffragists, often using the flimsy charge of obstructing sidewalk traffic. And many of the imprisoned women really, they saw several, terms of several months behind bars. And by the fall of 1917, suffragists began demanding that the court system really acknowledge that they had not been jailed for traffic obstruction. They wanted to at least have it acknowledged that if they were sitting in jail, they wanted it to be acknowledged by the police, by the government, that they were in reality political prisoners, because that's what they viewed themselves as. They were political prisoners of President Wilson. And when the United States courts refused to do that for them, many of the jailed activists started going on hunger strikes. So as steel gags were used to pry open jaws and feeding tubes were being forced down throats and up noses, tensions really escalated at the Occoquan workhouse, where many of the suffragists were held and imprisoned. And the events of November 15th became known as the Night of Terror. That night, guards really got pushed to their breaking point. And when they hit that breaking point and snapped, what happened was just kind of a mass beating and pushing and physical terrorizing of the suffragists who were refusing to cooperate. So one woman was knocked unconscious. Another was left all night with her arms handcuffed above her head. And when news reports of the hunger strikes and abuse began to reach the press, the American public was really outraged when they heard what was happening at the Occoquan workhouse. So looking to avoid bad press, President Wilson ordered the women released. And the suffering was really a small price to pay, however, for the picketers. That's the way they viewed it. They had begun their demonstration looking to capture the attention of the American public, and boy, did they do that. They were all over the newspapers. And in the aftermath of the arrest, the National Women's Party recognized the women who had served time in prison, and each one received a Jailed for Freedom pin, this little guy. And what they would do is, Alice Paul would present that to them and they could wear it. And what it was in recognition of their bravery and dedication to the suffrage cause. And while picketers can't take full credit for pushing the passage of the 19th Amendment, their extreme actions certainly played a really important role in turning many Americans into sympathetic supporters in many ways of women's voting rights. So I'm looking at the time. I want to get us, to make sure we have a little bit of time for some Q&A at the end. So like I said, there's no way to tell you all of the stories that appear in the book or show you all of the objects tonight. So to wrap things up, I do want to touch upon a very important object appearing in the milestones section of my book. And while, of course, there are many significant moments during the suffrage movement, I really feel like I would be remiss if I didn't share with you kind of the climax of the suffrage narrative. So of course, I'm going to end our talk tonight by sharing with you a historic treasure that represents that exact moment that ratification of the 19th Amendment occurred. So in a pretty modest archival collection at the Knox County Public Library in Knoxville, Tennessee, this letter and envelope are stored away in an acid-free folder in a little blue acid-free box. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, a letter? Really? We get to the ratification of the 19th Amendment and you're going to show us a letter? And in fact, I am, because this letter is one of the most charming stories you're going to find in the book. And it's really important to understand that archival material has such rich information within it. So in 1878, what would later become the 19th Amendment was introduced to the United States Congress for the first time. And named for the legendary suffrage leader who served as its initial author, the measure was first known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And put in basic terms, it sought to prohibit the denial of voting rights based on sex. That was it, pretty basic. And over the next 41 years, the legislation was occasionally brought up for discussion or consideration by either the House of Representatives or the Senate, but honestly, it was always quickly kind of squelched and just put aside. By 1919, however, national opinion on the topic really had begun to change. And President Wilson had finally endorsed women's suffrage, and a large majority of the American public supported the measure. And through various local and state, successes, suffragists had really worked to prove that a federal amendment was the next natural step. So in May of that year, both the United States House of Representatives and Senate approved the proposition. However, before it could officially become the 19th Amendment, another major hurdle needed to be cleared. So by law, 3/4 of the nation's states needed to ratify or approve the measure. And with 48 states comprising the country at that time, that would mean that suffragists would have needed 36 of them to approve the new amendment, to put it into effect. So as you can imagine, suffragists really wasted no time putting pressure on their state lawmakers to bring the measure before state legislatures. And they knew that the longer that the amendment sat, the more momentum it would lose. And by the summer of 1920, their advocating had really paid off. And 35 states had approved the amendment, and while 6 had rejected it. So kind of doing the math, they knew that if suffragists could win the approval of just one more of those states, they would finally achieve that goal that they had been working on for decades. And it was in that really tense climate that suffragists were finally able to convince Governor Albert Roberts of Tennessee to call a special session of his legislature to consider the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And when the day of the session arrived, Nashville was really swarmed with pro-suffragists and anti-suffragists and members of the public who simply just wanted to be on hand for the historic moment and to see what was going to happen. So as Tennessee's representatives filed into their chamber, suffragists already had a pretty good idea of how many planned to vote in favor and how many planned to vote against the measure. And let's just say it was going to be a really close call. So when Representative Harry T. Byrne a man who had already pledged to vote against the amendment, took his seat, a House page delivered a small yellow envelope to his seat in the third row. And at 10:35 a.m., the Speaker of the House banged his gavel to signal the start of the session. And as debating began, the room really started to grow warm and, the mood was getting pretty agitated. But in the third row, Representative Byrne opened up the envelope that had been delivered to him. He read the letter, seen here. He then refolded it and then slipped it into the inner breast pocket of his suit. So soon after the voting process began, after barely voting to keep the measure on the table, after 2 rounds of voting, the legislature began an official and final vote on whether to approve the 19th Amendment or not. And all accounts of the day really describe the voting is a bit of a ping pong or tennis match going back and forth between, yes votes and no votes, those yays and nays. And as Representative Byrne heard his name called, it's hard to know what was going through his head. But knowing most of his constituents did not support women's suffrage, he had publicly pledged to vote against the measure. In his pocket, however, sat this little letter that he had read earlier that day. And it was addressed to the Honorable H.T. Byrne at the Tennessee State Capitol. And the letter came from his mother, a strong supporter of women's suffrage. And as he read the pages earlier in the session, he was met with these words: "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I've been waiting to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat. With lots of love, Mama." And as Byrne cast his vote, he called out aye instead of nay, as he had previously pledged to vote. And when the roll call was finished, the final count recorded that day was 49 votes in favor of ratification and only 47 against. And at that, the Capitol in Tennessee just exploded, both with cheers of joy and cries of defeat. And when Byrne released a statement to the press the following day, he explained his change in vote really quite simply. And what he said to the press was, "I know that a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow." So the fight for women's voting rights has really been, had been happening for decades and spanned multiple generations of women at the time of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And when 26 million American women secured the opportunity to vote in 1920, suffragists knew that their work wasn't finished. The ratification was not the ultimate victory, but rather really just one milestone on a longer journey. And that was a journey that continued through the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the campaign for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And the suffrage movement's legacy can still be felt today as American women continue to fight for seats in politics. And, just now we have a vice president-elect who is a woman of color. And, Geraldine Ferraro in the 1980s made history when she ended up as a VP on a presidential ticket. And today we have another woman making history again. So as you can see, it's kind of a continuing march forward. So thank you for joining me today. And obviously, if you're interested in finding out more or hearing more of the stories that are in the book, I would encourage you to seek out a copy of the book. I know that it is available through my publisher's website. It's available on Amazon, and I'm sure you can probably call up a local library or a bookstore and see if you can get your hands on a copy in some other way. So I'm going to stop doing my screen share here and toss it back to Kate.
Great. Wow, that was fabulous, Jessica. I feel inspired. I feel like...
Oh, good. The suffragists would be really pleased with that.
So I'd love to open it up for questions now. Again, feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. Just make sure it's that panelists can see your questions, or you can use the Q&A. Either of those work. And I guess in the meantime, if you don't mind, I'd love to start off. Just one thing I was thinking of is for me, it makes total sense that you would choose objects to sort of ground this whole story, you know, with you being a curator. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, maybe why you chose objects and, you know, how those can be just a jumping off point for telling.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, if you get onto Google or into your library catalog and you search women's suffrage, you are going to find that there is a ton of fantastic literature and scholarship that has been written about this topic. What you're going to find is that there's less looking at those tangible objects that have stood the test of time and are still with us. And besides just my background in curation, one of the reasons that I really wanted to go about telling this story this way is that objects are just really darn relatable, Kate. Objects, they're springboards, they're jumping off points, they open up doors. And when you see a three-dimensional object, even if it's on the page of a book, many times there's just a way to relate to that. It's a way to know that, you know, someone held that thing, someone used it. I have a quilt in the book that was made out of campaign ribbons. And when you look at it, you really get the sense that this was a piece that was used in a home. The suffragist and her husband who owned it used that. They made it part of their life. So for me, using letters, photographs, the globe that you know those students touched with their hands, that's just, for me, it just makes it so much more real. So that's one of the main reasons I tend to gravitate towards the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much power in them, right? They've got this intrinsic power in the fact that they experienced a history. Like
exactly. They wear the stains and the chips and the cracks and the war wounds of life and show that they were a real thing.
So here's a good question from Carol Jones. A quick one. What is the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette?
Great question, Carol.
It'd be great to get that clarified.
That is a delightful question, Carol. So if you read my book, you'll actually see this somewhat addressed early on in the early part. I only use the word suffragist in my book, unless I'm talking about suffrage supporters in Britain. So suffragette was a term that was explicitly used in Great Britain, and it was actually a derogatory term that the press over there used. Suffragette, oh, the little lady, she's not strong, she doesn't know what she's doing. And in Britain, suffragists really embraced that term and kind of wanted to turn it on its head and spin it back at the media and say, oh yeah, fine, we're going to embrace that, but take that, you're going to see how strong we are. Here in the United States, suffragette was like the biggest no-no word ever. If you used that to refer to a suffragist, a pro-women's suffrage, activist, she would say, no, I am not a suffragette, I am a suffragist. And one of the things that I really like is suffragist is actually a little bit broader because suffrage activists were not just women. So using the term suffragette really genders the term. Suffragist does not, because suffragists were men, they were women. It's just a broader term. And here in the United States, that's what was used. The only time you saw suffragette come up was usually when someone was trying to get a little bit of a thumb in there and jab someone a little bit.
Right. Ooh. Well, I know, that I'm sure some of us have slipped up between saying suffragist and suffragette.
Oh, everybody does.
Good to remember. So here's another question coming from Linda. Do you know who coined the term Republican motherhood? She's curious if it was used in the early Republic era or if it was a later term.
That's a delightful question. And without going to my weird stack of research files, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I think I saw that Mr. Alex Dubois is with us in the group. Does Alex know? Or does Kathy Fields know? Or Linda Hawking?
Well, if any of the Litchfield Historical staff on hand knows the answer, throw it into the chat. Oh, it was Linda who asked the question.
Oh, Linda! I don't know, Linda. I'll get back to you. Stay tuned. More to come. I'll let you know.
So,
1980s.
yeah.
My researcher that's sitting off camera tells me it was a term that was coined in the 1980s by people doing the research on that. Thank you, off-camera researcher. I live with another historian.
All right, so do we have any other questions? Feel free to keep adding questions, and if not, I'll keep throwing more questions out there because I've got tons. So I guess one of the things I was thinking of was, you know, I was so fascinated by the consumer culture aspect of,
Yeah.
and I guess my question is really, you know, how did they market sort of this, like, you know, when we see suffrage stuff, it has a definite tell, right? They use the same colors, they use the same sort of stylistic choices. How did they communicate that across this really broad coalition, you know, this national coalition, to create this sort of uniformity?
Very intentionally. So I mentioned that there's an organization section in the book, and it's that piece of it that helps to be able to do that universally across the country. So suffragists were really intentional in how they set themselves up. And there were a couple of kind of main national suffrage organizations. The largest of those was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they specifically had a setup that is kind of like a food pyramid. And at the top, they were up there at the point, and then below them were state level organizations that were satellites of them. And then below that were county level satellite organizations. And then below that were local level satellite organizations. And that was a way for them to kind of cyclically feed information up and down the ladder. So they had publications, they had newsletters. So through those venues, they were able to communicate across the country in all the different venues. You know, here's the official colors, which Connecticut's actually a bit of an oddball out on that. Hold that thought. But to say, here's the official suffrage colors. Here's the symbols that we use. In Connecticut, you'll actually run across tons of pins and various things that are purple, green, and white. Yes. Connecticut, parts of New York, and New Jersey are the only locations in our nation that used that tricolor in the United States. It was, echo. It was, that was the tricolor used over in Britain, and those locations, including Connecticut, adopted that tricolor. Otherwise, everywhere else, they just used yellow and gold. That was the official suffrage color.
Wow, that's fascinating, because being from Connecticut, you know, to this day, purple, white, and green are just like, are so ingrained as like suffrage colors that
you are unique.
Yeah, I did not know that. That's fascinating. That's amazing. All right, any other questions coming in? Not yet. Anything that was like so incredibly hard to cut from the book? Like any objects that like still you're like, I miss it. I wish it was there.
So many.
So many.
All of them. I often get asked the question as a curator, like, what's your favorite object? I'm like the worst person to ask that. I'm like, oh no, I feel like objects, like I personally know them and I'll offend them if I pick a favorite. Right. In doing research, I literally started writing out the options of the things that I thought were most compelling on note cards. And I sat on my living room floor with them out. I kind of felt like I did this exercise as a high schooler when my English teacher taught me papers, and I would sit with them and reshuffle them into thematic sections and organize them. And then I would be sitting there going, so if I pull one of these out, does that collapse the narrative? And so in doing that, one of my favorite things was actually a trolley card that would have inserted into the side of a trolley, and it was a pro-suffrage, pro-World War I trolley car. And I had the hardest time. I kept coming back to it and I kept wanting to put it in the book and I kept trying to put it in the book and I kept running out of spaces.
Right.
And it didn't make the cut and it makes me sad. It's one of the ones that if I did a volume 2, it would definitely be in there.
Oh, wow. But that's fascinating and shows so much about your process here. The fact that you are, you have, these are objects are chosen to symbolize the narrative, right? So it's like the narrative is the base and then the objects are, well, I mean, it's like a chicken.
No, absolutely. The book is supposed to, I kind of took an approach of approaching it like a piece of literature of there's a story arc and all of the objects play certain points in that plot line. And so finding the ones that fit and then being like, oh, but I can't lose that one. It was really, really hard.
Oh, so fascinating. I mean, we could, suffrage, I feel, again, the story is huge. We could go on forever talking about it. But seeing as, it's now 7 dinner time, so don't want to keep anybody too long. So again, Jessica, I just want to thank you so much for, for joining us for tonight and sharing this all with us. I feel like, the story of women's suffrage is just so relevant in our lives all the time, that it's just really fascinating to spend an evening thinking about it. And thank you again for sharing all of your work and research.
Well, thank you for having me.